Welcome to the echoes of past. Undoubtedly, most of us have seen these images belonging to Berlin a few months after the end of the Second World War. In it, we see how civilians try to make their way into a city which is completely destroyed by the bombings that it had been suffering for years, and by the final battle of Berlin. In today's program, we will analyze what life was like for the civilians of Berlin from the end of 1944 until the moments before the battle for the German capital and the subsequent arrival of the Soviets. Let's go back to Christmas 1944, when all the media attention was on the definitive offensive that had been launched on the Western Front. At that time, the food shortage was already tremendously evident, and those years were gone when everyone had a roast goose for dinner. After a few days of intense information about the advance of the German troops through the Ardennes forest, the news about this offensive gradually stopped arriving. This undoubtedly heralded the worst. A pessimistic mood was already taking hold of most of the population, picked up by the black humor jokes that were circulating around the capital at that time. This Christmas was practiced. "Give a coffin," said some of these jokes. The airstrikes on the city were only intensifying. On the one hand, the British bombarded the city at night, and the Americans during the day. These raids had already become so frequent that Berliners spent more time in bomb shelters and basements than in their own homes or directly on the street. This generated, among many other things, a significant lack of sleep, which contributed to a combination of repressed hysteria and fatalism. As we saw in the program that we uploaded a few months ago, in which we analyzed the 3 mega anti-aircraft towers of Berlin. These were the best shelters for the civilian population when the city was bombed. Although their size impresses us, it should be noted that in the original project, Hitler had ordered them up to 3 times larger than these that we are seeing on screen. With a capacity for about 10,000 Berliners, almost 30,000 people finally crowded badly when the sirens sounded the alarm. The situation inside was hellish when the bombardments began. When his capacity was tripled, the claustrophobic feeling only accentuated. The lights began to flicker, and on many occasions they would go dark. The water supply also used to fail when pumps damaged part of the water supply lines and toilets had to be sealed. This decision was not made due to the lack of water, but because due to the anguish and depression that many people suffered, they ended up committing suicide inside after locking the latch. These suicides only increased from the beginning of 1945 onwards. An atmosphere of imminent collapse reigned in the capital, both in personal lives, which were completely broken, and in relation to the existence of the nation. People spent the money they still had without any moderation, knowing that it would soon lose its value. Many girls of all ages were rushing to get pregnant by someone they knew before falling into the hands of the soldiers of the Red Army, which, according to the stories that came from East Prussia, this was going to mean. In buildings that were completely collapsed and that could no longer be inhabited, families left written on the walls the new place they were going. These messages were addressed to their husbands and children, who also did not know if they were alive or not, since they kept the hope that they would return from the front and be able to find them. Meanwhile, the day-to-day for Berliners consisted of the pertinent preparations for the defense of the city, work in one of the factories near the city that were still operating, and in the search for air raid shelters in which to protect themselves. It is estimated that the population that was in Berlin at the beginning of 1945 was around 3 million people. Obviously, there were not enough shelters for everyone. Whether in basements, bunkers, flat towers, or in the subway, they were all overcrowded and with their capacity occupied 3 or 4 times higher than recommended. This caused the air to become excessively charged, and in many of these shelters, water generated by the mist dripped from the roof. Many sites were even affected by the decrease in oxygen, which was a danger for the thousands of people who crowded inside the shelter, because if they were not careful, they could even die from lack of oxygen. To monitor these oxygen levels, candles were used at different heights. When the one at ground level was turned off, the first alarm would go off and the children and anyone who was seated would get up as far as possible. If the one that was located at a height of about 50 centimeters also turned off, those who were at that level were preparing to crowd as they could in other areas. Finally, if the candle that was at a height of 1.5 meters was extinguished, the total evacuation of the site would proceed. On some occasions, this had to be done forcibly, even though the bombardments continued to occur. There was no alternative, or they would leave the shelter and risk being hit by a bomb, or they would die safely inside. It is difficult to imagine living a single day under these circumstances, but could you imagine being like this for months? In addition to these millions of Germans living in Berlin, it is estimated that there were also some 300,000 foreign workers brought mainly from Ukraine, Belarus, and other neighboring regions. The situation for them was even worse than that of the Berliners themselves, as they were forbidden to enter these shelters due to lack of space. And when the Soviets finally won, most of them were then sent to gulags. As the year 1945 progressed and the situation for Germany became more and more distressing, the thinking of the population became fragmented. On the one hand, there were those who wanted to plant an armed resistance to the end, with a morale that had not yet diminished. On the other hand, there was the other population group that was more numerous, and all they wanted was for the situation of suffering to come to an end. Although it is not possible to calculate how many of them were willing to surrender, since it was forbidden to affirm that kind of thing in public, there were many who trusted the latest announcements that were given from the Goebbels ministry. These alluded to the imminent appearance of new miraculous weapons, which would turn the situation around at any time. So that we can better understand the thoughts that many Germans had in that situation, we are going to read one of the letters that a Berliner sent to her husband, who was a prisoner on French soil. I have so much faith in that we are finally going to win, that nothing can break a trust born of our long history, of our heroic past, as Dr. Goebbels says. It is impossible for events to develop otherwise. We may be in a very bad situation at this point, but we still have many determined men who are willing to fight. We have secret weapons that are reserved for use at the right time. Stay strong and don't let them bring you down. After the arrival of the Soviets a few kilometers from Berlin, already in February 1945, with the offensive, the work to erect barricades in Berlin was increasing. Just as these kinds of tasks increased for the German population, so did the ever-increasing restrictions. Everyone knew that despite the difficulties that had been dragging on their day-to-day for months, the worst would come when the Soviets set foot in the city and the battle for Berlin began. On April 12th, the last concert of the Berlin Philharmonic took place. At that time, the city was already a few hours from being directly attacked by land. Those attending the concert knew that they were trapped in the city and that the Soviets were already a few kilometers from it. It was very cold inside the bomb-damaged building. There was no electricity, and no one even took off their coat. They were all somewhat upset and quite serious, worried about the apocalypse that was looming over Berlin. Finally, as if it were a dramatic opera, the concert ended with Richard Wagner's work entitled Twilight of the Gods, this being the soundtrack with which the city fell. 4 days later, the battle for Berlin began. Well, so far this program, in which we have seen what life was like and how the atmosphere was in Berlin a few months before their final fight. In future programs, we will analyze other aspects of the battle that will surely catch your attention. This is it. Subscribe and support this channel on YouTube if you like this program, and see you on the next program. See you soon.